So for those of you who are just joining us, we started this journey about a year ago, and it was our church history journey. So a year ago, I was in town, not even yet living here, but I was in town for a month. And during that month, I had the opportunity to do 4 lectures about church history, early church history, like the church fathers. And so we did that a year ago. And then like half a year ago, we did the next session, which was originally entitled Medieval Theology. That title didn't test very well with the public, so we renamed it The Empire Strikes Back, I think we called it. And it seemed to go over better that way. So that was about half a year ago, and that was 4 sessions on medieval theology. And now we're on to the 3rd unit of this church history class, and we've made it to the Reformation. So if you haven't been part of the first 2 sessions, you should be all right. I might refer to them a little bit, but mostly this will be standalone lectures about the Reformation. So thanks for joining us. I'll dive right in, unless I'll gladly field questions at any point. Just get my attention, and I'll turn off the engine and listen to you. But if I don't see you flagging me down, I'll just keep pressing on. Okay, so yeah, introductory comments. I just have to say this, is my heart dies a little bit every time I refer to the Reformation. That's a fiction. The Reformation is not like there was one thing that happened in history and it's called the Reformation. The Reformation is not like the Civil War, right? If we're talking about the Civil War, we're talking about something, an event in history. The Reformation doesn't function like that. There wasn't the Reformation, and it didn't start, whatever it didn't start in 1517. There was, more accurately, there was a whole era of reformations, right? That's why I call this class the Reformation era. Because we are in now an era in the church of reformations. And these reformations, this was a pious and holy stirring within the church in response to some of the corruption and rot that had crept into the church, right? And so these reformations, there's always been faithful people in the church, always. And so when the church was drifting more and more towards corruption, which we saw in our medieval theology course, right? There's still godly people within the body of Christ who are not pleased with that, who are not pleased with the corruption and decay, and who are raising their voices for reformation. So that's happening. That's ongoing. It didn't just start with Martin Luther. That's going on within the church during this whole era. And that's why I call it the Reformation era. Okay, so, and that's why I'm following this outline. It's on your first page, but here's where we're going. We're going to talk about the pre-Reformation, which I just kind of alluded to, as a lot of things were happening prior to 1517. So we'll talk about pre-Reformation today. Then we'll talk about the Reformation proper, which is the story that most people do know already, and the names that people do know, Martin Luther and John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli and people like that. That's kind of the Reformation proper. Then we'll talk about the Radical Reformation. The Radical Reformation came right on the heels of the Reformation, and it was a group of churches and individuals who thought the Reformers didn't go nearly far enough and wanted to just take the football and run hard. And the big thing about the Radical Reformation, well, okay, so within the Radical Reformation, there were a lot of emphasis on believers' baptism. Because the Reformers, like Luther and Calvin, were baptizing infants, same as the Catholic Church. And now in the Radical Reformation, they're like, well, as long as we're questioning everything, why don't we question how we're doing baptism? And so, but part of the reason behind that wasn't just about baptism. The Radical Reformation really wanted a radical separation between church and state. And if you're baptizing babies, you start using those baptism records as citizenship papers, right? And church and state become almost, you can't even tell the difference. And so the Radical Reformation is saying, let's get baptism out of the hands of the state and let's put it in the hands of the church. And the way to do that is to wait until people can give their own testimonies for baptism. So the Radical Reformation had a political agenda to get church and state separated. Calvin didn't want that. Luther didn't want that. They're referred to as magisterial reformers. The magisterial reformers, like Calvin and Luther and Zwingli, did not want separation of church and state. It was the radical Reformation that wanted that. And this will take us, let's not go down that rabbit trail just yet, but what Calvin wanted, he wanted distinct but dependent. He wanted church and state to exist distinctly, but he didn't want them separated. He wanted them dependent on each other and working together so that the state is enforcing the morality of the church. And the state is punishing the heresy that's being spoken in the church. Calvin wanted them working together. It's the radical Reformation that pulled them apart. Okay, so that's our third session. The fourth session is the Counter-Reformation. That refers to how the Catholic Church responded to the Reformation. The Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church did two things. They've made a very clear theological statement saying the Protestants are wrong and they're out. They're not part of what we're doing. But they also, as part of the Counter-Reformation, acknowledge that they're wrong, but they actually identified some real problems, and we want to address those. So in the Counter-Reformation, the church began to reform itself and address some of the problems that were within the church. And they also drew a clear line. We're not Protestant. We're not doing what they're doing. That's the Counter-Reformation. And then the English Reformation, I doubt we'll get that far. We'll run out of time before we make it to the English Reformation, but one can always hope. The English Reformation, that's the Puritans. That's what I wrote my dissertation on. So as we get closer to the English Reformation, I know more and more what I'm talking about. So if we get there, that would be good, but we'll see. All right, that's where we're going. If anybody has any questions, otherwise, let's put our seatbelts on and hit it. Here we go. Renaissance humanism. Heart pounding. Renaissance humanism. So what are we talking about here, and why do we begin our discussion about the Reformation talking about humanism? Well, first of all, you need to know that humanism today, when you hear like humanism today, you normally associate that with someone who rejects the claims of revealed religion, right? A humanist, someone who doesn't believe in the supernatural. They just, kind of man is the measure of all things humanist. That's not what we mean here. When we talk about Renaissance humanism, what I just described is secular humanism, right? That rejects religion. Renaissance humanism, a lot of the people who ascribed to that were very devout men and women who were committed Christians. So there is a way to celebrate the accomplishments of humans that still points to God, rather than taking God out of the equation. And so these Renaissance humanists were doing that. They were saying, humans are amazing. It's okay for us to celebrate the amazingness of humans and what humans have done, but let's use that as an arrow to point us to their Creator, to point us to God. That was a lot of what was Renaissance humanism was all about. And so the kind of the cry or the theme or the motto of Renaissance humanism was ad fontes. Ad fontes. That's a Latin phrase, and it means back to the fountain or back to the sources, back to the original. That's what these humanists, Renaissance humanists, were all about. Is basically what the Renaissance humanists were saying is they're like, well, we're drinking this cup of water and we're kind of used to it by now, but actually it's pretty gross. It's like dirty and tepid and not refreshing, but this is what we got because this is what we were given. But this came from somewhere. We don't actually have to drink this. We can go back to the sources. This came from somewhere. So let's go back to the sources. That's what Renaissance humanism was all about. It was a phrase, ad fontes, back to the sources, was first used by Petrarch, and he was referring to the poetry of Dante. And what Petrarch said, he's like, when I read Dante, it feels like totally new, totally fresh. Nobody else is writing poetry like this. It makes me feel differently. It feels new. And then he thought more about that, and he said, wait a minute, this is not new. This just hasn't been seen in a while. This is actually quite old. This is an old way of doing poetry. Because do you remember what he's comparing it to? Scholasticism. And if you were in our lectures for medieval theology, you remember like scholasticism was so boring, right? And it was they just had to break everything down, right, into like logic, and that's all everything was about, was logic. And so in medieval scholasticism, do you remember like Anselm's ontological proof for God? Do you remember that? As if anyone was ever edified by that, right? It was just like a total brain problem to figure out that God exists. Or Aquinas had those 5 proofs of God. Or like they had, like remember they had these arguments like, well, if you go to Mass, that is a meritorious work, so you're earning credit with God if you go to Mass. But what if you come late? Do you still get full credit? Like, how late can you come? Literally, scholastic scholars were debating how late you could come to Mass and still get credit with God for being there. And then there was a question of, okay, but you got to at least be there to receive the host, right? To take the Lord's Supper. They didn't get the wine back then. Only the priest got the wine. They only got the host. So you had to at least be there for the host. But then the question came, what happens if you've eaten the host, chew him up, digest him, leave the service, and then you throw up? You like remember the theology of transubstantiation, right? Like you just threw up Jesus. And the question is, do you still get credit for that? And where they landed is not only do you not get credit for having taken the Lord's Supper, it's actually a sin to have thrown it up. So now you're in double trouble for having thrown it up. So all I'm saying is those are just examples of what theology was doing in medieval times and how refreshing it was when they came along with this ad fontes, like, hey, you know what? There's other ways to do this, and they're not nearly as boring, and they're way more edifying. That's kind of what ad fontes was all about. And it was Dante's poetry, at least at first, that got people to see there's a better way. There's a better way. Okay, so what that meant, if we're going back to the fonts, back to the sources, linguistically, that means they're getting away from Latin. Everything's in Latin in medieval theology, right? All in the West, not in the East, but in the West, it's all Latin. And it's deciding, okay, let's go back to the sources. The Bible wasn't written in Latin. What was the Bible written in? Greek and Hebrew. Well, let's learn those instead of always studying the Bible in Latin. And so what they had prior to this was the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate. That was a version of the Bible translated by Jerome in the late 4th century, think kind of time of Augustine. And he translated it from the best manuscripts he had of Hebrew and Greek into Latin. And then that was the Latin Vulgate. And it's a pretty good translation, but that's all people were working with until they decided during the Renaissance that, you know what, actually, there's a source that goes further back than the Latin Vulgate. Let's go to that, back to the sources. And so now we're reading the Bible in the original languages, in the Greek and in the Hebrew. Also, what happened at that time, Constantine fell to the Turks, right? We're back to thinking about the Crusades and what was happening. And when Constantine fell, a whole lot of Western scholars were living there, and they got driven out and they got driven back. And they brought with them all of their books and manuscripts from the library there, and that library was full of resources from ancient Greece. So 1453 is the year that this happened, very specific. And in that year, a whole wave of resources from ancient Greece got reintroduced into Europe that had been not available for a long, long time. And so all of a sudden now, they're reading Plato, and they're reading Sophocles, and they're reading scientific treatises that were written back then, and they're realizing, whoa, these people were super smart, and they loved beauty, and they were into rhetoric, and they had this like beautiful vision of what human thriving was like. And so it was exciting, intellectually exciting, and they were saying, like, what if we took that and put it with good Christian theology? Wouldn't that be something? And so there was this excitement in the air of, like, there's a new way to do things. Christianity doesn't have to be so boring all the time. So that happened, and if you can, like, picture, like, what's happening in Europe at that time, like we're getting closer to things that we actually know about, right? So, like, picture the if you're my age or younger, but not too much younger than me, there's a narrow window here. Picture the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right? Okay, Donatello, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, right? That's how people my age learned about all of those artists. So the mutant turtles were named after them. Well, think about the art that's being made and the architecture that's happening during this time, right? It's designed to remind us of classical forms, right? These paintings and these pillars on buildings and epic poetry. This is hearkening back to an earlier time. This is like nostalgia. Like if people today kind of long for the 1800s, the simpler time before, you hear people like that, right? Well, that's what they were doing here, but they were longing for the good old days of ancient Rome. That was kind of a movement that was happening, okay? And so technologically, paper is now starting to be available. They start making rags, using old rags and turning it into paper. So all of a sudden now, starting in the 13th century, paper's more available, which makes manuscripts more available, which makes literacy more possible. And then, of course, in the 15th century, we get the printing press, right? Which is a huge advance when it comes to disseminating information and promoting literacy, right? Because now, all of a sudden, for the first time ever, at least in the West, China probably had this sooner, like they had everything sooner, but in the West, this is the first time that it's actually cheap to print in mass quantities, right? Which is especially important for Protestantism, because Protestantism is a religion of the book, right? That's foundational to our the way that we relate to God, to our faith, is the book, the Bible, being able to read it. And so the printing press is obviously a huge innovation that is going to really promote the Protestant Reformation. So there's actually a bit of a chicken and egg debate amongst scholars. They wonder, the question, the debate is, were loads of Bibles suddenly printed in Europe because Protestants love to read the Bible? Protestants wanted the Bible so much that once there's Protestants, Bibles just start churning out. Or was the printing press invented and they started churning out Bibles, and what happens when Christians read their Bible is they become Protestant? And so it was actually like, it's a subtle distinction, but do you see the difference, right? The question is, did the Bibles come first and reading the Bible made us Protestant? Or did Protestants come first and Protestants printed so much Bibles? My guess is that it's a bit of both. But that was happening at the time, is all of a sudden Bibles are coming into circulation. Bibles in languages that people can understand. So, what happens is, right, this back to the source, let's learn the way they did things back then, means that Christians with this like kind of attitude of back to the source in the air are realizing, okay, what's the source? Because up until then, the source for Christians was always, well, whatever my priest says. That's the source. And in some places, in some towns and villages, you were lucky if you got a priest to come through twice a year, right? 2 sermons a year, and maybe if you're lucky, when he comes through, well, I mean, I heard someone laugh. Yeah, that'd be all right, 2 sermons a year. But you also only get the Lord's Supper 2 times a year, if you're lucky. And so, anyways, the priests would swing through town. They would have all the authority. What they said went. You couldn't like push back on it. They were the primary source, right? But all of a sudden now, there's this kind of atmosphere where it's like, well, but wait a minute. Are they the source? They're not the source. They're the conduit. They're the pipeline. Is there a way I could bypass that and get to the source? And people were realizing, yes. As a matter of fact, God anticipated that and provided us with this so that we can go right to it, right? Do you ever wonder like why that phrase, the priesthood of all believers, was so important to the early Lutherans? Because of that. Because priesthood of all believers means I am allowed to go to the source myself. That's a big deal for Christians. Of course that's going to revolutionize the church. And so what happened is when people started going to the source and reading the Bible for themselves, they all of a sudden started saying things like, wait a minute, what was that chapter and verse again that taught about the indulgences? Because I'm not finding it. There's got to be somewhere in there, right? It's not? Okay. Well, what about purgatory? Is that in there? On and on and on. The list starts going and people start realizing, I've been told some things that either I misunderstood what I was being told, or I was being told in an inaccurate way. And so this is starting to revolutionize the church. Slowly but surely, the Bible has a tendency to do that. So a particularly important scholar comes around, named Desiderius Erasmus. Desiderius Erasmus. He is the greatest. Like, no one even debates this. He is the greatest of the Renaissance humanist scholars. Absolutely. If you want, he's often called the Prince of the Humanists. If you want just one stat, one fact to prove that he was the greatest, in the 1530s, in all of Europe, not just where he lived, but in all of Europe, Erasmus's books counted for 10 to 20% of all sales in the whole continent of Europe. He was that, like, no one, like today, no one can even touch that. Can you imagine an author with their books personally are 20% of global sales? It's nuts. That's what Erasmus was. He was the greatest scholar of the time. So his background, he was Dutch. He was born in Rotterdam, Holland in the year 1469. He died in 1536. His parents were not married. His father was a priest, and priests are not allowed to get married. But they're also not supposed to father children. But anyways, 1 out of 2 ain't bad. So anyways, by all accounts, though, his father and mom were good parents. They loved him. They raised him well. They were good, loving parents. They gave him a good education. He was very, very smart, like smart and precocious from a very, very young age. And then his parents both died of plague in the year 1483. So Erasmus was 14 when he lost both his parents to plague. By then, he had just stood out so remarkably as a student that he was sent to top schools in Europe. And he was sent to a school where Greek had just begun to be part of the curriculum, right? We were just talking about this, right? Like, Greek is the hot new thing. Greek is what all the cool scholars are studying now. And so he gets sent to a special school that specializes in Greek. That would be like when I was in high school, we thought we were so cool because we had a computer lab. And we were like the first, we were told, probably we weren't, but we were told we were the first school in our district that had a computer lab. And it was like so cutting edge. However that felt to me back then, and it felt pretty cool. That's how teaching Greek was in medieval times. If your school was teaching Greek, you were pretty cool. You were cutting edge. And so off Erasmus went to learn Greek, and he excelled at everything he does academically. He just absolutely excels. He ends up becoming a priest at the age of 25. Not because he didn't really want to be a priest, but he was qualified. He had done all the studies, and he needed the money, so he became a priest. I'm not saying he was a bad priest. He just wasn't into it. He was just much more of a scholar. He was very much focused on the books, not the people. So he ended up being sent to the University of Paris, and then he ultimately was placed to be a professor in Cambridge, England. So he published, in Latin it's Novum Testamentum Omne. All that means is all of the New Testament. All of the New Testament. He published a critical edition of the New Testament in Greek, using the very best Greek manuscripts available at the time, right? So cutting edge scholarship for the time, all the best manuscripts in Greek on one side of the page. And on the flip side, he did an updated Latin translation. So you had both facing you on the page when you're trying to study the Bible, the Greek on the one side and the Latin on the other side. This is the first time ever in the history of the church that a book like this has been published, ever. The year is 1516. Erasmus did it. By God's grace and with his help, Erasmus put that resource together. The second edition came out 3 years later in 1519. That's the one that Martin Luther used for his famous German translation that everybody read and everybody had, the Luther Bible. He used Erasmus's Greek Bible in order to make that translation. 3 years later, William Tyndale, He did his very famous English translation, right? The Tyndale version, where it like revolutionized the country in England because now they could read the Bible in English. He used Erasmus's Greek version in order to make his translation. So it's very, very, very important that Erasmus put this together. Okay. A couple of very important books. I said he was the most popular writer in Europe by far. Two of his important books. He wrote loads of books. Two important ones. In Praise of Folly. In Praise of Folly was written in 1509. It was published in 1511. The reason is because it was so dangerous. He couldn't find a publisher. No one wanted to touch it because In Praise of Folly is just a really strong critique of the Catholic Church as a whole. It's written in the first person from the voice of folly, kind of like if you've read Screwtape Letters and how it's written in the voice of the devil. Well, this book is written in the voice of folly, and folly is like singing about how wonderful and active she is in the church, and how she is the source of all human pleasure. And she's helping people in the church make decisions to go after pleasure and experience pleasure. And she claims that without a bit of illusion and stupidity, life would be dull. So she keeps life fun by keeping everybody kind of dumb and pleasure-seeking. And that she's really doing a good job of that within the church. That's kind of the gist of the book. So you can imagine why it was kind of a dangerous book to publish. The Catholic Church didn't like hearing that critique at all. But he followed it with one that was even more harsh. Remember, he's part of the church. He's a priest. He's Catholic. So he follows it with a book called Julius Exclusus. If forced, maybe this is my favorite book written at the time. Julius Exclusus. So that's written specifically about Pope Julius II. His nickname was the Warrior Pope. His years of being Pope were 1503 to 1513, so just right before Luther does his thing is when he's done. And in the story, Erasmus doesn't even make it a metaphor. He just makes it him. Like Pope Julius is standing at the gates of heaven. He's just died, and he shows up in heaven, and he's trying to convince Peter to let him in. That's the premise of the book. And just so you understand who we're dealing with here, Julius II, he commissioned the destruction of St. Peter's, the church in Rome, the old one that had been around for 1,200 years, like that one, like the super old St. Peter's. He tore it down so that he could build a new one, the current one, the one you're picturing. And the reason that he did that is so that he could be buried in it. His timeline was off. It took him 100 years to build it, so he didn't get to be buried in it. But that was the idea. And he's also the one that commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. That was Pope Julius. These are very, very, very expensive projects, right? St. Peter's, Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo. So he's got to raise money. And so he leans hard on two things. Indulgences, right? Sell a lot of indulgences, make a lot of money, and also military, war. That's a good way to make money if you're successful at it. So that was his thing, his papacy, believe it or not, right? The Vicar of Christ. His two things were selling forgiveness of sin for money and conquering other armies with war. That was him. Okay? So you can understand why Erasmus didn't like the guy. And so he writes this book, and Julius is up there talking to Peter, trying to get into heaven, and Julius behind him is all of the soldiers that he promised when they came and fight for him, that when they die, they would immediately go to heaven no matter what they did on earth. All those guys are behind him as he's talking to Peter. And Julius is drunk. And he's trying to open the gate of heaven with his own key. It's the key that he uses for his money box. And he's trying to get into heaven with it. Okay? And so Peter is there. And Peter tells him, you can't come in. And Peter talks about all the things that he did on earth. And Julius gets so angry, he threatens Peter with his army. He's like, well, we're coming in after you anyways. And then he threatens, he's like, I'm the Pope. He threatens to excommunicate Peter. And then Julius explains all the stuff that he did on earth and blah, blah, blah. But he says, it doesn't matter because I'm the Pope. And I have authority to excuse sins. It doesn't matter what I did. I can just absolve myself. That's how this game works, Peter. I'm not going to make one political aside right now. I'm just going to keep pressing forward. This is what happened, is that he thinks he can exonerate, he can do whatever he wants because he can exonerate himself. Peter does not buy it. The Apostle Peter is not impressed with that line of reasoning. Ultimately, Peter, I love this line. It's so good. Peter says that Julius is a contagious disease, and therefore he cannot come into heaven, and he gets refused entrance. Now you can imagine, by a book like that, it would be very, very hard to get that published around the time that the Reformation was about to happen, right? But in the year 1517, he did in fact get that book published. That's a significant year, isn't it? All right. So we just to be clear on this final point is that Erasmus remained Catholic until his death. He did not leave the Catholic Church. He wrote books critiquing the Catholic Church because he loved the Catholic Church, and he didn't want it to go away, and he didn't want to leave it. He just wanted to reform it. That was kind of his way of engaging in Reformation from within. He got connected with Martin Luther. They knew each other. In fact, Erasmus and Martin Luther wrote letters back and forth to each other. We have those letters. We know what they wrote to each other. At first, they're very warm and friendly letters. They like each other. Luther is actually trying to recruit Erasmus. Join this thing that we're doing. It's good. You'd fit right in. You're like a prime candidate. And Erasmus is interested. He writes that Luther is a mighty trumpet of gospel truth. That's pretty favorable. He writes also this: it's clear that many of the reforms for which Luther calls are urgently needed. Okay, so it seems like there's an aligning of values there, maybe even a young budding friendship. But eventually, it becomes clear to Luther that Erasmus just doesn't have it in him. He's not going to jump ship. He doesn't have the courage to cut ties and come along on this new thing. And so Luther starts getting angry. Luther had a bit of a temper, right? And so it starts coming through. His letters to Erasmus start getting more edgy as he gets more disappointed with Erasmus. And so what happens is, it's very, very interesting and something to think carefully about. Luther ends up deciding Erasmus is a coward. He knows what's right. He knows the Catholic Church is wrong, and he's just a coward, and he's not willing to leave. And Erasmus's response is, you have totally misunderstood me, Mr. Martin Luther. Obviously, I'm not a coward. Have you read my books? I'm not a coward. I just love unity, something that you don't seem to have a taste for, Mr. Martin Luther. You seem to not care if you smash this beautiful house apart that God has built. I am committed to preserving it unified. It's not cowardice, it's a commitment to unity. That was the difference between, basically Erasmus and Luther, were pretty closely aligned on their theology. Not right down the middle, but close enough that you'd think they would have been able to partner. But it was that question. Are we breaking away, or are we promoting unity that they couldn't decide on? That's an important point to think about, that all Christians need to think about. Obviously, all of us, assuming that everyone in here is Protestant, has decided that that was the right call, right? That it came to a certain point where preserving that thing was no longer possible, and so we needed to do a new thing. And at some points, everyone here has somehow made some sort of decision like that. But then at what point does it happen again? Because what we're going to see as we keep going in this story is that, okay, when was the first split, right? Basically 1054, right? East and West, right? I mean, there were little minor splits earlier on, but basically the big one was 1054, East-West, Orthodox, Catholic. Okay, and then we get to 1517, 1520-ish, Reformation era, and we get one more split, right? We have a big branch, it's the Catholic Church, and then we got, okay, Protestant. All right, well, now there's three options. There's Orthodox, there's Catholic, there's Protestant. The three is manageable. You can hold three in your hand. Three is manageable. Okay, but did we just start a precedent when we did the Protestant thing? Because how many denominations are there now? Last I checked, there's 47,000 different Protestant denominations in the world right now. 47,000. So, what happened was, at some point, people on the Protestant branch of the church started going, oh, wait a minute, they did that? Well, we can do that. We're allowed to split when we disagree. Let's go. And then all of a sudden, the tree just starts branching like crazy. Now, is that hard baked into the Protestant Reformation? Or was that avoidable? And is that even a bad thing? Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. But those are important questions to ask. And that question about courage to split versus courage to stay and promote unity, those are important questions that Protestants need to think very, very carefully about. Otherwise, we're going to end up with 100,000 denominations. Okay. Somebody's hand was up.
How come the Catholic Church allowed Erasmus to stay within the church after publishing those books?
Yeah, the Catholic Church, that's a good question. The question was, why did they tolerate that? They obviously kicked Martin Luther out, and they weren't afraid to burn heretics, so what was the deal with Erasmus? Good question. There's a couple of ways to answer that, and there's probably ways I don't even know, but as far as I know, a couple of things are happening. One is that Erasmus had very powerful friends. He was very well connected throughout Europe. He was at the top tier of the theology that was happening throughout Europe, and so he was protected. But then also, the Catholic Church has a fairly robust tradition of allowing a certain level of dissent within, in order if you know that you're the only game in town and it's either you or that you have to leave, then you're going to tolerate a certain amount of dissent in order to keep everyone in the barrel. And so there was a bit of a tradition of allowing, it's kind of like, you can go this far and no further. And Erasmus was pretty good at playing the game, this far and no further. Whereas Martin Luther was like, no one tells me what to do, and he would run right past that line. And so that was kind of the difference. Really good question. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so then what we've basically done is we've walked through Renaissance humanism and we've talked about Erasmus, and we see kind of like the theological and the academic and the intellectual kind of mood in the air, and how everything was right. By God's design, by his timing, everything was right for the Reformation. And so now we can talk about Marty Supreme. Martin Luther. So a couple people get that. Martin Luther. I'll start. We got 5 minutes, and I'm not one to waste 5 minutes. So we'll start, and then we'll pick it up. However far I get, we'll pick it up with Martin Luther next week. Okay. So here's Martin Luther's origin story. He was born November 10, 1483, and he was. I'll fly through this because you know Martin Luther's story. He was studying to be a lawyer. That was his dad's plan for him. His dad wanted him to be a lawyer, and he was into it. At least he was, insofar as he wanted to please his dad, he was going to be a lawyer. But he was a boy who experienced so much spiritual anxiety, right? You know, kids like that. I was a kid like that. Maybe you were, where it's just like you're always worried, like God is angry at me. I just know he's angry at me because I know what I've done. I know what my heart is like. How could he not be angry at me? Luther was one of those kids, all the time, anxious. Anyways, what happens is that culminates in he's out on a trip, he's on his horse, he's going through a forest, it's a huge, huge thunderstorm. He's really scared, he's afraid he's going to get hit by lightning. This feels like God's wrath. Have you been in a storm like that where you're like exposed and it just feels like it's so fierce? The storm itself feels like God's wrath. He was in one of those. He prayed one of those prayers that you pray when you're in a storm of wrath. He prayed, "Help me, Saint Anne, and I will become a monk." Saint Anne, as you know, is Saint Mary's mom. And so he prayed his prayer to Mary's mom, Anne, and said, basically, "Anne, if you get me out of this, I'll become a monk. That's my deal." And people pray prayers like that all the time, right? On airplanes and turbulence, and then they land and they conveniently forget what they prayed, right? Well, Martin Luther stuck to his word. He stuck to his prayer. After that, he made it out of the storm alive, and from that moment on, he pursued becoming a monk because he made a deal with St. Anne, really with God. And so he joins a monastery. And it just seems like, well, if you're going to solve the problem of spiritual anxiety, a monastery is a pretty good place to go. But it didn't work. In fact, it had the opposite effect. His anxiety actually grew. And his anxiety is being caused by the great dilemma. And maybe I'll describe the great dilemma and we'll end it there. So here's how he would describe the source of his anxiety as he is experiencing the great dilemma. The great dilemma is this. Martin Luther, is unrighteous. He knows that. He feels it. There's no denying it. He is unrighteous. That's his status. And yet God very clearly requires righteousness of his people. There's no question. That's obvious. Okay? So Martin Luther cannot deliver the goods to God. I'm unrighteous. God demands righteousness. I don't know how to get from here to there. It's a dilemma. He knew he couldn't be good enough to please God. That's the great dilemma. So how do unrighteous and sinful people satisfy a righteous and holy God? That's the big question of the Bible, isn't it? And that was the question that he had. And so his first attempt at solving the great dilemma was by being the best monk he could possibly be. Which is how most people at first try to solve that dilemma, right? I'm not righteous. God needs me to be righteous. I guess I better start acting righteous. So he tries to do good works. He tries to be a good monk. He tries to rack up enough merit points to earn God's favor. This is what Martin Luther writes. This is Martin Luther's words. I was a good monk, and I kept the rule of my order so strictly that I may say that if ever a monk got to heaven by his monkery, it was I. All my brothers in the monastery who knew me will bear me out. If I had kept on any longer, I would have killed myself with vigils, prayers, readings, and other work. So at this time, he's going to confession daily. He's sometimes sitting in the confessor's booth for hours and hours, racking his brain, trying to think of everything that he possibly had done wrong that he could confess. One time, he was kicked out of the confessor's booth by the priest, who said, "Get out of here and don't come back until you actually have something to confess, like murder or adultery." So that's a crisis, right? That's a spiritual crisis. His supervisor, a guy named Johann Staupitz, a real hero in this story, he tries to help him out, and he says to Martin Luther, he says, "Look, Martin, the trick is not to make God love us. The wounds of Christ are sufficient evidence that God loves us. The trick is for us to love God. You don't have to get God to love you. Look at Jesus. He loves you. What you need to focus on is not getting God to love you. You focus on loving God." And Luther realizes in that moment that he actually does not love God. In fact, he hates God because he sees God as the tyrant who is standing over him with a club and who is ready to pound him because he is not able to be righteous in the way that God wants. That's his picture of God. A tyrant waiting to thump him because he's not good enough. And he suddenly realizes that even though he spent his whole life kind of pursuing God, he actually hates God because he's just expecting sooner or later this God is going to crush me. And that's the great dilemma. And maybe we'll leave it right there and come back again next week and see how the great dilemma is solved. Thanks for coming today.